Today's event on domestic service workers, increasing identification through outreach, is presented in collaboration with Womankind, formerly the New York Asian Women's Center, and it's my pleasure to introduce Mary Caparas. Mary is the project-free manager at Womankind and has worked directly with community members who have faced labor exploitation, labor trafficking, and abuse. She continues to not only raise awareness about human trafficking, but also move forward nuanced conversations about the root causes. Now I'll pass it over to Mary to share with you some of her wisdom and insight on connecting those at risk in the domestic service worker industry for labor trafficking.
Thanks, Charlie, and thanks everyone for attending. Thanks as well to the rest of the framework team for carving out the space to really highlight domestic workers and outreach. So before I start reading the objectives for the next slide, I'm just doing a quick scan of who's in the room, just to get a sense of who's there. I know a lot, a lot of people's cameras are off. Or you can't turn them on. So that's great. It looks like there are service providers, there's a prosecutor's office, and there's anti-trafficking clinic, and it looks like, yeah, a few potentially familiar faces there. So thanks again. If we could switch to the next slide. So for today's objectives, we are going to learn about the occupation of a domestic worker in the US, and then we'll hopefully gain some insight into the history and current national landscape of domestic work. And at the end, I'm hoping that you're able to take so much from this discussion today and create your own outreach plan in your state or your region. Next slide, please. So plenty of times, domestic workers themselves will take on just about every and any kind of task that occurs in a house. So from changing a baby's diaper to cooking meals to even taking care of houseplants. So it's important for you to know how the Department of Labor really defines this job. So I won't, read each individual thing on the slide there, but two things I wanted to note in the first part of the definition here is that, one, private home, right, is mentioned. Two, there's work. The work itself is of a household nature. So you can see how broad this definition is, but you can hopefully start to get a sense of who's not a domestic worker. So for example, a company that sends a licensed plumber into a house, not a domestic worker. The other part is that domestic workers are supposed to be covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act, or the FLSA. However, there are exemptions still in place. So for those of you unfamiliar with the FLSA, basically it establishes things like, minimum wage, overtime pay, among other things. So let's just stay a little bit though on this part of the definition in terms of exemptions. So who is not covered under the FLSA? So who's not covered? Live-in domestic workers. So they are actually exempt from overtime pay, although they must be paid the, federal minimum wage, which is about, I think, $7.25 an hour at this point. So, I wanted to really highlight that for you all because there are still exemptions out there. And these are, there's these other issues that domestic workers are not included in other protections, but we'll mention that a little bit later on. Next slide, please. So we come to our first poll already. Now that I've kind of given this very simple definition of the role of the domestic worker. If you can answer this. So according to the Department of Labor definition, which of the following do you think can be examples of domestic workers? And you can pick multiple here. So are domestic workers janitors? Are they babysitters, school teachers, home health aides, contractors? And I'll give you a little hint on the contractors. We're talking about a builder from a company. So I'll give you just a few seconds. Okay. All right. So, wow, a lot of people said babysitters. Yes, definitely babysitters. Great. It looks like people knew, some people knew janitors. A lot said home health aides. We have a pretty informed crowd here. Some said school teachers and some said contractors. So for those of you who might be a little confused about the janitors, why they can be considered domestic workers, they actually can if they are not employed by a company or they're actually employed by an apartment building's tenants. So that might be a surprise to some of you. And at 29%, I could see that that probably is a surprise. School teachers, you know, because they're employed by a school, no. Contractors, I gave that little hint and you might have already voted at that point. But thanks so much. And it looks like a lot of you definitely know babysitters can be considered domestic workers. So thank you. And let's just go to the next slide. So here are some examples of domestic workers. What I want you to take away from this list are that domestic workers cover multiple fields and roles, showing how labor trafficking can really happen in so many different areas. Next slide, please. Okay, so speaking of labor trafficking, we've just been defining domestic work itself. But now, what is the crime that domestic workers face in regards to labor trafficking? So here is the answer. Mainly involuntary servitude. So now I'm not a lawyer, but the more and more I am part of this work, the more I realize how grounding and actually helpful the law can be, especially if someone is seeking help from their labor trafficking situation or broadly their human trafficking situation. Something to note here though about the definition, involuntary servitude can be the threat of force, not just physical force. Next slide, please. So data, here we are. So here's some data from the 2013-2017 National Human Trafficking Hotline. This data that I'm highlighting in the next two slides are discussed further in a document. You'll see that QR code that's linked there, and I believe you take your phone and scan the QR code there. I encourage you though, as you look at these numbers in relation to your clients and communities, to really think critically about them. So let's take a look. Here, in terms of type of trafficking, we have labor at 93%, right? So that's a clear majority. However, at Womankind, and I'm sure other programs across the country, we found that this can often overlap with other survivorships, including sexual violence or some form of workplace violence, intimate partner violence, right? So it would not be surprising that the percentage of sex and labor trafficking might be a little higher there. In terms of victim gender category, this looks to be more of an individual count than a percentage, so just kind of take it as it is at the moment. But you can see that female domestic workers are the sizable majority. But think about how many domestic workers are actually female. So that biases that sample size a bit. At our program at Womankind, we're seeing actually a rise, and since last year alone, of male labor trafficking survivors, some of whom are domestic workers. And then we have age here. So the age calling the hotline. So they're mainly adult, and in our work at Womankind, the average age is actually in their 40s. But you should also think further about who usually has access to phones, or who's even reporting that they're working and are domestic workers, let alone that they're being trafficked. So this percentage possibly could include more minors. Next slide, please. So how are people actually coming over to the country as domestic workers? Here we have the top 5 visas, and it matches a lot of the clients we've served who are domestic workers. B1 is the temporary business visitor. A3, G5 is the diplomatic visa and their assistant. B2 is the tourism visa. And then J1, a lot of folks call it the cultural exchange visa. F1 is the student visa. So the takeaway from us here is that people are really coming through different temporary visas, and it's just not one kind of visa. In terms of nationalities, here we have, can we just go back a slide there? We have the Philippines, Mexico, US, India, and Colombia. So we're seeing 2 very similar nationalities too at Womankind, so Philippines and Mexico. And this list also includes US born, but domestic workers tend to be more likely born outside of the US than any other type of worker in the country. So it's actually, it's difficult to fully comment on this top 3 there. But the takeaway from this data is that it's also important to note what data is missing. Next slide. Okay, one more slide with data here. So this data is from the Economic Policy Institute. I'm showing this to you to really highlight 2 things. As of 2019, there are 2.2 million domestic workers across the US. And the other thing is to show you that their occupations are largely as home care aides and that they're employed by an agency. So the next slide, please. So I'm just going to set up this video. It's always really good to give context and history to all the data. So here is a video that touches on some history of domestic work in this country, along with some present day realities.
¿Y ahora tú qué tienes? ¿Qué? ¿No me vas a hablar?
No puedo, estoy muerto.
When I saw the movie Roma, I saw myself and I said, this is what I do, this is my life.
¿Qué haces? Ya dime.
No puedo, estoy muerta.
Even though the movie was set in the 1970s in Mexico, I am one of over 2 million domestic workers who face similar struggles in the United States today. Roma is sparking a much-needed conversation about the value of domestic work. The reality is, 1 in 4 domestic workers live in poverty because we were excluded from minimum wage and overtime protections. We suffer abuse from employers behind closed doors because we have been excluded from the basic workplace protection against discrimination and sexual harassment. This is 2019 America. It's time for change. These injustices are rooted in the legacy of slavery. In the 1930s, when other workers were gaining labor protection under the New Deal,
to guarantee to labor adequate pay and proper conditions of work.
Lawmakers in the South specifically excluded domestic workers from those labor rights. They didn't want to give an inch to their own black employees, and they didn't see women's work in the home as being real work. As for coloring, I've been a nanny for over 18 years. I migrated from St. Lucia, where I worked with the Attorney General.
Beautiful.
I was hired to take care of the children, but I had to clean the bathrooms, I had to dust, I had to mop with no extra pay. Years ago, one of my employers left dog poop for me to pick up. I said, no, this has gone far enough. I continued speaking up, and eventually I was fired.
So, full disclosure, I have not seen the movie Roma, but I've really heard it's excellent at showing a lot about what Jackie is describing in terms of the hardships associated with domestic work. But the takeaway here is that, you know, domestic workers were often excluded from certain worker protections. So these campaigns have really been integral to addressing vulnerabilities within the occupation itself. I hope you're also seeing how for a domestic worker, standing up to an employer sometimes meant being fired. And it's a reality that folks are facing every day. Next slide, please.
¿Y ahora tú qué tienes?
So this is just a quote from an interview of Ai-jen Poo from the National Domestic Workers Alliance. Basically, Ai-jen is repeating the fact that farm workers and domestic workers continue to be excluded from key legislation that carve out certain protections. And they continue to be more vulnerable to forms of exploitation and abuse as a result. Next slide. So here we have some risk factors for domestic workers. I just went through quite a few slides where you see the industry itself. We know how domestic work is in fact less protected than other industries and work. We also know that the very nature of the work inside a home makes people more vulnerable to forms of trafficking. This risk factor can also be an outreach challenge because now you have someone more isolated in their workplace, and reaching them in an environment you don't know about is usually not a safe option. So the other risk factor, communication. So while domestic workers are proficient, can be proficient in English, many of them grew up outside of the US. So there's this combination of some linguistic challenges and cultural challenges. So for example, we've had clients, you know, not really question their employer because they felt like as a domestic worker, raising concern would be seen as a complaint. And they may have come from, you know, a social political environment where that was not acceptable. So it becomes very hard to speak up. When I mention limited devices, I mean that sometimes, you know, domestic workers might have a cell phone or it's provided by their employer. It also becomes harder for domestic workers to keep in touch with family back home or to build new friendships with others, especially if most of their work, again, is in a private home and not somewhere public where they get to interact with coworkers. This risk factor also creates a challenge for outreach. Being able to communicate with someone about issues happening at the home becomes very difficult, especially if their employer is monitoring their cell phones. So I'm going to actually go ahead and combine communication with lack of support network here as a risk factor, because being unable to communicate and being in a home really limits building a support network. In terms of immigration status, as many of you on the call are aware, many domestic workers are here on temporary work visas. So the moment they become undocumented, life becomes even harder now because they're unable to work legally. They're unable to do things like access public benefits, right? They're feeling less protected than US citizens. And there's a fear of calling, a very real fear of calling 911 because they're worried about deportation or just getting in trouble. And then the other risk factor is a history of exploitation. So some domestic workers come from a history of exploitation, including back in their home countries. When you layer this history along with further exploitation or abuse, there's really this deep cycle that becomes hard for them to break. And then there's limited freedom of movement. So some domestic workers, especially those living with a family, may be limited by their employer. Think especially during these COVID times, right? That employers have increasingly asked nannies to ensure that they're not getting COVID, and that's usually an implication to limit their contact with others. So this feeds into that, feelings of isolation or actually being isolated, and it increases vulnerability. The other risk factor are stigmas. So with the work of domestic workers, there's a kind of class system that they're trapped in from their home countries, where they're now bringing that definition of themselves into the US. And as we heard in the video with Jackie, domestic workers, even in the US, have been left out of a lot of protections. And arguably, those class systems can still exist for them here in the US. It becomes difficult to really reach out to domestic workers who are feeling like essentially their work is their life. And meanwhile, they have families back home that are depending on their remittances to survive, or they're struggling to survive and will find any work possible. And then last but not least, gaps in education. So I say here, gaps here, because individual domestic workers may already be aware of some of their basic human rights, and they may even have received degrees from back home. But there is oftentimes a gap in knowing what their actual rights are and what it might look like if they do speak up. So I'll pause here. And if you just step back and take a look, at this, all of the words on this slide, you can see that most of the risk factors for clients are actually also outreach challenges, and everything is connected. So I've just gone over some really tough risk factors. Now let's switch tracks here and think about some solutions and tools. So how can we try to overcome these challenges through outreach? Next slide, please. So let's try to develop materials. Back in 2013, 2014, we were then called the New York Asian Women's Center. And we asked ourselves some preliminary questions when we were developing materials. So who is your target audience, right? Who do you want to pick up that flyer? Another question to ask yourself, will this information be helpful to them? And I know sometimes people will actually create a focus group to see if the materials are meaningful, but sometimes a lot of organizations just don't have the capacity or the time to do any of that. So, there's unfortunately a little bit of trial and error that's involved, and maybe don't put so much pressure on yourself. Try to create the best kind of material you can. But I have to say that getting feedback from domestic workers themselves will probably be your best feedback there. 3, are your visuals welcoming? Are they inclusive? I'm going to suggest that you should not, and I say not, default to anything triggering, salacious, just because you're really encouraging someone to pick up the pamphlet. If we're talking about countering a lot of the stigmas against domestic workers, your visuals should be affirming and encouraging and not fall into stereotypes. And that brings me to 4, asking yourself, are you using appropriate language? So the more straightforward the communication in your materials, the less room for confusion and translation. However, you need to really strike a balance as well and ensure you're not triggering someone's trauma or offending them. At Womankind, we have staff speaking more than 18 Asian languages plus Spanish, and the materials are actually translated through at least 2 advocates, one who is usually a native speaker and another who's proficient, if not fluent, in the language. And there's usually a series of edits and discussions, and while the process might not be the quickest, it's striving to produce trauma-informed materials. And then 5, last but not least, how will you distribute the materials? I strongly encourage you not to distribute materials to the residents they're working at, because you just never know what their situation looks like. You may also be putting them in more danger. So I do suggest trying to build connections instead and relationships with groups that are reaching out outside their homes. So next slide, please. Here are some examples of what we have created at Womankind. So on the left, your left there, was an ad that we took out on the back of a church bulletin. And part of that was the reality was a lot of our clients who are domestic workers attend church. So was this effective? Yes and no. Yes, because we did get a few calls from parishioners or survivors themselves from that church. No, because a lot of them were needing to speak only with an attorney and they weren't specifically disclosing a particular survivorship. However, you know, we would offer still some form of referral, and they got to know us and our existence. You know, we do exist. And we built a bridge to this church that many domestic workers attended. So it was only really a matter of time that there would be a ripple effect. On the other side there, you see is a more recently created flyer of our services. We decided to focus on the image of food because food, you know, brought together staff and clients. On the back of the insert or flyer, which you don't see, are very simple flags to trafficking, as well as our services and helpline number. But here, let's talk about the play on words. There is no such thing as a free meal, but there is free help. For a while, you know, we're patting ourselves on the back for a great team effort and the clever use of the word free. And including this very old saying that I'm not even sure is around anymore. However, you know, while community members ended up actually picking this up at events or, you know, at our offices, some thought it was actually a coupon for a good meal. Or when it's translated into another language, it just didn't make that much sense for them. So there are plans to really revitalize all of the program materials, but something we certainly took away from this was that ultimately someone will pick up that flyer, right? They'll see the phone number and they'll give you a call if they really need to give you a call. And what happens during that initial phone call and how they're treated, that is its own outreach moment. So next slide. So here's some recommendations of where to access clients for outreach. Okay, so because we don't have hours together right now, and you know, we're not everyone's cameras are on, I have only one suggestion here. So create an Ecomap. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with an Ecomap, it's something social workers and organizers have used to show social or personal relationships of an individual or communities. And I'll show you an example in the next slide based on a drawing I created actually back in 2013. As you build out this Ecomap though, first think of a couple of things. You know, think about if you are already working with domestic worker clients already, use your own community data, right? You don't have to start from scratch. You don't have to, you know, now pull like all these different people. So if you're new though to working with a group, create the map based on research done by other groups. So, you know, I've mentioned NDWA, the Hotline, you know, there are academics out there, institutes, there's going to be research for you. So next slide, please. And here, finally, let's stay here for a little bit, is an example of the Ecomap. There isn't really a strict formula to this map. You can pretty much flex it to whatever works for you. You can just take a pen and paper, but if you have more advanced software, that's even more amazing. So you start at the main circle here. So I'll just give you kind of a brief overview of what that looks like. Let me just enlarge my screen. So we'll start here with the center. That's your organization or your group. And you'll see here on the right, there are some arrows, and that shows relationship. So a two-directional arrow going both ways just shows that there is a real solid link, a good solid relationship with the other entity. And again, you can fill in the circles, with whoever you think in your community or in your area that you might already have some of these relationships with. So here we'll start and go counterclockwise. Current social service providers, and I have here basically small, medium, large size, okay? Just for the simplicity of the discussion. So small social services, let's say you actually have this great connection, or somebody in your organization has a great connection with them. So you have that link there. But then let's say there's this medium-sized social services organization that you've both been doing parallel work, and maybe you've heard of them, but for whatever reason you just haven't really talked to them. Maybe it's time to reach out, especially if you've heard that they've also been providing services to domestic workers. And then we have here the larger sized social services organization. And it's just one directional. Let's say you've almost had zero capacity all the time, so you've had to refer clients to them instead, but there's a relationship there. And I think really for most relationships, whether they're individual or community oriented, the hope is that there is the two-way arrow happening, that you are basically trying to make as much connections and contacts as you possibly can. The other thing I just kind of wanted to skip to for time's sake is that where you see here workers' rights, very important. And as you'll see later, why that's important, because there's certain legislation. If you see some of those sign-ons at your different organizations, so-and-so has signed on to fight for 15, right? Minimum wage, $15 is the federal minimum wage. And you're looking underneath the sign-ons and there they are. There are all the organizations, perhaps even individuals, that are signing on. And why are they signing on? Usually there's a vested interest because maybe they're already serving domestic workers or, low-wage workers more broadly. So things like that you might want to think about. And, I could go on for a while about this map, but really make it as flexible as you can, and tailor it to your community. So next slide. Okay. So who are your partners in these efforts? Here's a list of partners, and they've been informal and formal for us at the organization. But you can formalize some of these relationships, especially if you have a grant, right? So you approach people who you can make these formal partnerships with and say, we have a grant, it'd be great if we can formalize with an MOU, and just make sure that the MOU doesn't have language that, makes them beholden to so many things. And that could be a way to also be a conversation starter. So I'm just going to really highlight 3 of these. Other domestic workers have been partners friends of domestic workers. And I really encourage that, because if you're trying to help domestic workers themselves will be the ones that will be the most helpful for the movement here. Professionals within the community. So when I say that, an example would be a lawyer that's been providing pro bono assistance to clients with T visas. And there are some out there, and people don't realize, you know, some people just want to help, and they try to do it quietly by helping individual persons. But the reality is they're there, and you might want to try and, you know, reach out to them, maybe even partner with them. And then the third here, I'm talking about domestic worker groups or alliances. Throughout the country, there probably aren't as much domestic worker groups specifically, but you know, you can find growing numbers of them, and with folks like NDWA, they're really increasing a lot more of that. Next slide, please. So now I'll actually go ahead and tell the story about how we began engaging with more domestic workers, again, back in 2013. That seemed to be the magic year, in New York City. And it started with a workers' rights campaign. So basically, several years ago, you know, I was just beginning at the organization, and I was actually invited by a fellow graduate of our community organizing program in New York City to attend a workers' rights campaign around wage theft, right? And it was there that after, you know, here I was sitting there after normal working hours, so it was like 6 or 7 p.m. or so, and I sat in the audience and I listened to a play completely spoken in Spanish by workers themselves, acting it out. And they were acting out the issue of wage theft in their community that started with bad recruitment practices. And suddenly I had this light bulb moment, you know, where I realized, whoa, you know, these are our clients too. And a lot of them face these very similar situations where recruitment agencies disappeared or defrauded them after they took their money and tried to place them somewhere. So since that night, we joined the campaign for only about a year because the campaign had to regroup. But being part of the campaign really, you know, had quite an effect. So we learned more about other groups. We connected with even more community organizers of other workers' rights groups. And eventually, those groups began referring us to members of their communities, including domestic workers. So from there, we really increased awareness on anti-trafficking efforts, but more importantly, we were witnessing this amazing moment where domestic workers themselves were advocating with and for each other, and they're raising their voices on specifically labor trafficking issues. So, you know, as social service providers, we really became part of the overall support system, and that micro advocacy that's needed to break these cycles of exploitation, we saw it happen. So next slide, please. So here are some of the lessons we learned, and we, you know, are open to continue learning them. Basically, one of the things we learned was it's important to know the history and context. And I know some of you are probably going, of course, you know, you should know the history and context of groups of people. But it's something that, you know, we just have to continue to keep at the forefront of our efforts. So the other was that it helps to know other community organizers, but most people really are also, you know, just welcoming a genuine desire to help. The other is really don't expect one entity to suddenly open the doors of connection. It's going to take time. And then the other is do expect that building bridges to key stakeholders often leads to a larger web of outreach and continuing support. And you'll see, even with that Ecomap, hopefully you saw that in the visual, you'll end up creating a web. Next slide, please. So we also learned that not all domestic workers stay in or join groups. So, but we also learned, you know, it helps to be connected to those groups in case they ever seek that support. And here we're already at 6. My parting suggestion for all of you here is that even in this digital age, and where we really are social media savvy in a way, word of mouth is still very crucial. Next slide. So I'm going to end with this quick video. Basically, if you kind of watch that video too on your own on YouTube, hopefully it kind of just helps to simmer some of your thoughts and really show that there's a small but crucial way that word of mouth actually will spread these days in the form of a text message. So I think that's actually it for now. That was a lot to cover. Okay, so now I'm actually going to turn to Regina for any lingering questions from you all.
Thank you so much, Mary. And because of the lag, I'm going to move out of the PowerPoint. So hopefully you all can just focus on the responses for the Q&A with the presenters.
Thank you, Charlie. And thank you so much, Mary. You provided so much wonderful information. And I hope that we can take the next few minutes to address some questions that have come in that focus on a bit on some of the topics that allow us to expand on some of the topics that you shared a bit about today. And just for those of you attending, my name is Regina Bernardin. I'm the technical advisor for anti-trafficking programs at the International Rescue Committee. And part of my work is also in supporting framework and our wonderful speakers like Mary today. So Mary, we're going to jump straight in to the Q&A. The first question that came in was around what are some groups where you have seen in your work with Womankind, domestic workers gathering. You talked about, for example, the collaboration and even in some of the outreach material that you developed with faith-based organizations like churches. Are there others? The person who asked mentioned supermarkets or tiendas or shops. What are some other examples of places that domestic workers frequent?
Let me just clarify, other places or specific churches? Was that the question?
I think overall, if you found, for example, specific communities or churches or organizations or congregations, as well as just any location that you think might be a place where, as we engage into outreach, could be a place to target.
So, I don't want to specifically mention specific denominations, but Catholic churches have quite a lot of domestic workers that are their parishioners. And, we found Catholic churches in New York that have migrant centers that are part of it. So, when you have those two together, it's just that's just magic. because at that point, they're already there for kind of to help with the religious, spiritual aspect of someone's life, but then they're also doing migrant workers' works. So there's a lot of Catholic churches that seem to have a lot of that.
And are there any other locations that you have identified, for example, in your work when you do assessments with survivors, places or points where they could have maybe either come across material or individuals that could have passed on that information?
So we haven't ourselves as an organization reached out in playgrounds, but I know organizers have gone to playgrounds. The other, I'm a little hesitant to say playgrounds though, because I know there are those postings and rules, especially in California, where it says, nobody who doesn't have a child should be lingering in this playground. So if that's parks, there are also other ways. The issue there too is you also don't want to startle someone, or I know in New York most of the time if you try to come up to somebody, they're like, no, they don't even let you start talking. So, but in your area, if you have like a smaller community, I could see that, you can approach somebody in a very respectful way and, try to hand out some flyers and just making sure people don't feel like they're victims, but showing that you just want to spread the word.
Excellent. Well, and you talked about word of mouth and now even in the passing of flyers, but one of the questions that has come up, and that's the one that's been the most upvoted, was that this is already an isolated group because of the nature of working within the home. And now due to the pandemic, that probably has exacerbated that piece around isolation. So how do you reach now people who are either at risk or because of the type of visa and the situation within the employment, or are being actively in a situation of trafficking? How do you reach them now and pass on this information during a pandemic?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important question. And, if you look around in terms of providers, there's actually a lot of providers right now seeing an influx of potentially, I don't know if just generally referrals, but also other domestic workers are telling other domestic workers about that provider. And there's this increase happening right now, especially during the COVID era, because now people are looking for things like financial assistance, right? They're just not affording rent. So, unfortunately, because of COVID, this is actually also creating its own outreach where people are calling of their own, because they're being referred by other workers or other domestic workers. So again, I know that COVID itself is creating these challenges, but we, in terms of our clients who are domestic workers, they're quite savvy with cell phones already, and just being able to text somebody, listen, there's this organization that's been helpful to me for the past 4 years. Maybe they'll actually be helpful to you now.
Yeah.
So that's why I keep saying word of mouth is really crucial too.
Yeah, and I think your answer also highlights the point about collaboration and people now seeking assistance. So, for example, if someone is able to connect with whether it is historically a community health clinic, but maybe now a food bank or food distribution, of giving them the information to be able to also pass along to others. So, I think, going back to your point about engagement of that one agency alone cannot do it, but that getting that information to others who might be able to get the information out, back to your point about word of mouth, how even, and particularly now in COVID era, how crucial that is.
Yes, definitely.
Excellent. Another question is around how do you all track, and whether you do it or if you know of a best practice of, well, I guess the question, let me go back, is do you track calls and emails does Womankind track the calls and emails it gets back to a particular material or drop location? And if so, how? And if you don't all do it, if you know of a model or best practice around, how are you able to know which have been the most effective ways or locations for engagement?
That's a great question. I know for Project Free specifically, we haven't been doing that tracking. I can actually, get back to that specific person and ask we have an outreach manager that I can ask what some of those efforts look like. But, unfortunately, we don't have that kind of awesome mechanism, but maybe if others want to share in the chat something that they've come across, that's also, I think that would be amazing too.
Okay, and we're also happy to pass along any information in our subsequent communication when we share the recording of today's event and the link for the follow-up for the survey. For those who don't have the opportunity to fill it out today, we're happy to pass along any information that you are able to get after today's event. So thank you for that. Another question that came up is, are there expected changes to the employment laws that you discussed that may improve working conditions in the near future? I know that we've seen now a lot of talk about a raise on just minimum wage, and I know you've mentioned minimum wage in general throughout today's presentation. Any expected changes that you know of?
I know back in 2019, and again, this is all kind of pre-COVID in a way, there were some federal laws, or actually there was a desire to create more of this domestic worker bill of rights federally. And I know that would, because I think several states right now have those domestic worker bill of rights, including New York. But there's been growing support for that, and I'm forgetting the name of it, but if you just kind of Google 2019, domestic worker bill of rights legislation, you'll see, I think there's Huffington Post articles on that. But that's the biggest, kind of in your face domestic workers related legislation. I know state by state, there's whole, a lot of different groups, including in Connecticut, where they are trying to, just really increase federal minimum wage, or just minimum wage within the state. So I think that there's so many efforts right now. And I mentioned Fight for 15 generally, and I know that's not specific to domestic workers, but it actually would make a world of difference, especially if they're only earning if someone's being labor trafficked in a domestic worker, they're really not earning much at all. But I highly suggest just Googling that. There's some amazing things happening federally.
Thank you. And I had one final question, and this is because a theme that's been come across for our outreach events, or there's been a lot that we focused on imagery as well as language, and you talked about visuals and how they can be triggering, and talking about, you used about trauma-informed language, which I love, to the fact that you framed it from a trauma-informed way. Can you talk about a little bit of what types of visuals you think can be successful, or visuals that you think we should stay away from, also looking at it from a trauma-informed lens?
Sure. So, I know I kind of showed some of the cons to putting food on a flyer, but it also got people to kind of take it and look at it, right? So I think things like that, and even in that image of the flyer that you saw, it really was very just beautifully done. And there's something tranquil about the food. It's not like there's no crazy red colors or anything like that. I could probably talk for a very long time about what not to put on a flyer. And I know prior presenters have talked about that. So I just want to say, please don't put somebody like in a maid's outfit. Please don't, just do not.
Yeah, and that's a great starting point. And so we thank you so much for that takeaway. And thank you so much, Mary. I think that Charlie is going to just say a few words before we wrap up. And I know we're seeing here also about our upcoming event, which I'm going to put a plug out if people can join us for March 30th on restaurant workers. Charlie, any parting words as we come to the end of today's event?
Just as always, appreciation for Mary and all that you put into this presentation, all the insight that you have on connecting with partners in our areas. Let Framework know if you have any more questions on how to build similar partnerships in your area, and sign up for that next event and let us know how you felt about today. We're always looking for feedback. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.